Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Debate program with your host Tariq Khan. Today we'll explore and analyze Pakistan's relations with GCC member states, Gulf Cooperation Council member states, or Pakistan's relations with Gulf countries. Let us bring our guest in program, Honorable Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed. You are research fellow at Alfred Deccan Institute, Deccan University, Australia. Sir, thank you so much for joining Debate program, and you are most welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tariq, for the invitation.
Sir, how would you describe Pakistan Gulf relations, Pakistan GCC member states relations? What is the reason and commonality behind the close ties of Pakistan with GCC states? How would you analyze?
Of course, when we look at Pakistan's relations with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries or GCC states, first of all, there is cultural element to that, or ideological element. Most of them are Sunni majority countries, and so is the case of Pakistan as well. And there is, of course, special place of Saudi Arabia for Muslims in Pakistan. So there's strong connection with Saudi Arabia as well. And historically, Pakistan has been a kind of a security provider to some, if not all, of these Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia in times of crisis when there was Iraq, Kuwait war. Pakistan had sent soldiers to Saudi Arabia, and at any single point, there is security cooperation. So Pakistan's armed forces or officers from Pakistan's armed forces, they are involved in different kinds of assignments in Saudi Arabia, mainly in training capacity to train Saudi troops, and similar is the case of other GCC states. And of course, Pakistan's former Chief of the Army Staff, General Zahid Sharif, is heading the Saudi-led Islamic military alliance there. So there is that element as well, and then comes the economic side of things. So there's a large number of Pakistani diaspora in Gulf countries, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. More than 2 million Pakistani workers are working in the Gulf region, and that is a very solid source of remittances for Pakistan, and that contributes to Pakistan's GDP. But beyond that, these oil-rich Gulf monarchies, they have often come to Pakistan's rescue in times of crisis, in the shape of aid, in the shape of loans, including interest-free loans and so on. So the relationship is multidimensional. There is cultural element, there is economic cooperation, there is security cooperation. But beyond that, there is also diplomatic angle, and often on the issue of Kashmir, Gulf countries have actually shared Pakistan's point of view, although there have been some differences recently because many of them are actually leaning towards India in terms of their economic cooperation, but they still understand Pakistan's anxieties in relation to the India factor in terms of relationship with the Gulf countries. And the Gulf countries are also trying to maintain this kind of a delicate balance in terms of their relations with India and Pakistan. So there's then this diplomatic angle, but also considering now what is happening in Afghanistan, and we see that despite some recent hiccups in Pakistan's relationship or relations with Gulf countries, especially following the Abraham Peace Accords, when Bahrain and the UAE, they normalized their relations with Israel. And after that, there was a lot of pressure on Pakistan to do the same, to recognize Israel as a state and then, normalize relations with them. Of course, Pakistan has not done that because of various other reasons. But there was this pressure, and before that, there was that episode when Saudi Arabia had asked for Pakistan's troops to join that Saudi-led military coalition against the Yemeni Houthis, and Pakistan had said no. So there have been actually few hiccups in the recent past, and due to which some unprecedented kind of events have also happened. For example, Pakistan took loan from China to repay to Saudi Arabia, which is unlike any time in the history of two countries' relationship. So that has happened. But recently in Afghanistan, we have seen that there's some convergence in terms of Gulf states' relations or interests with that of Pakistan's interests. And historically also, there were only three countries who had recognized the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and they were Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Pakistan. And now Qatar is a much bigger player as well because the Taliban have an office in Doha. So considering that, now there is that sort of geopolitical dynamic to the relationship as well, as the Gulf countries want to influence these fastly changing developments in Afghanistan.
Sir, do you think sectarian factors have reduced in dealing with Gulf countries, especially with Iran and Saudi Arabia? How do you view this context?
So there is some hope, because recently there is some talk of both. There's some talk of rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Only time will tell to a degree to which they will really normalize their relations. But as far as the Gulf countries, if we look at all of them, especially Abraham Peace Accords or normalization of relations of some Gulf countries with Israel, provides that evidence that they look at Iran as their common enemy. So this is a common factor between Israel and the GCC states, most of them, that look at Iran as their key enemy. Of course, for the Jewish state, it is not the matter of actually sectarian identity. But for other countries, it's a matter of sectarian identity, especially Saudi Arabia. For UAE, it's different as well, because UAE has territorial disputes with Iran as well. So the dynamic is different. Oman has been historically has been neutral in this regard, and same is the case of Qatar. That has been trying to maintain good relations between in terms of their relationship with Iran and other GCC countries. And Iran was one factor that led to the Qatar Gulf crisis a few years back. And now that actually dispute, one can say, is over, because Qatar has normalized now its relations with other GCC states after that episode. So there's some hope that things are changing. But if we look at the bigger picture and how some of these GCC states are closely aligning with Israel and also with the US, it sends a clear sort of message that there is going to be a geopolitical or geostrategic realignment with reference to Iran. And of course, that will influence the ideological or sectarian dynamics within the Middle East, especially. But when it comes to the whole Shia-Sunni conflict, we have to wait and see how Saudi Arabia and Iran will engage in other countries, especially, let's say, in Afghanistan. How, for example, if Iran goes on to support some Shia militias there, there were some reports talking about that Iran could reactivate Fatimiyun brigade that had fought in Syria, and many of its combatants are now back in Afghanistan. But that didn't happen really. But that's one possibility that this IRCG could look at, or the Iranian state could look at. So, but these developments will keep on happening, and most of that depends on, as far as you talked about the sectarian conflict, I think most of that really depends on the political will in Iran and Saudi Arabia, to a degree to which they really want to normalize their relations. Their relationships have their relations have actually hit a rock bottom in the past 4 to 5 years because of their proxies, especially Iranian proxies in Syria and also Yemen and so on, and how Saudi Arabia itself now feels Iran as a direct threat, and no longer that indirect threat to its state security. So they have to de-escalate, I think, that level of threat. And once I think their relationship is normalized, that will have a very positive impact on the Muslim world in terms of peace and stability.
Sir, as you have mentioned the economic perspectives, so how would you analyze and explain in more details that what is the trade and investment environment of GCC states or Gulf countries with Pakistan?
GCC states have actually invested in Pakistan in different ways, but of course their investment is nowhere closer to, let's say, now China's investment in Pakistan, which at the moment I think stands at $64 billion through the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I don't know exactly how much of that China has really spent in Pakistan, but in terms of Gulf countries, I think Saudi Arabia initially had shown interest in investing in an oil refinery in Gwadar. That project really didn't kick off. The UAE has shown interest that they want to also invest in Pakistan. But if we look at the real sort of impact of, let's say, GCC countries investing in Pakistan, it's not much, but the potential is there, and it very much depends on a degree to which the UAE and, let's say, other rich Gulf countries, especially like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they see Pakistan as a viable sort of market for their investment. If there is security and beyond just political interests or beyond just transactional kind of relationships, because Pakistan is a big market, so if they want to invest, they could. But they have other options, in terms of economic cooperation or trade. I think India has taken lead there. But still, Pakistan has that cultural advantage and diplomatic advantage as well in terms of relationships with the GCC states, and that could play some role in terms of convincing these Gulf countries to invest in Pakistan. So far, if we look at trade, it's mainly limited to a few sectors that Pakistan exports as agricultural commodities, maybe textiles, and maybe leather goods and other things. And in terms of security cooperation, Pakistan also sells some of its like some of its weapons or machinery that helps the GCC states in terms of modernizing their military. So Pakistan has been, I think, selling Al Khalid tanks to Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries for a number of years. Now could be opportunity to sell JF-17, and already Pakistan has received contracts from Nigeria, Argentina, and Malaysia, and so on. So perhaps GCC countries could be interested in. As far as the UAE is concerned, I think they are purchasing most of their military items from the US and other Western countries, and same is the case with Saudi Arabia and so on. So Pakistan has a lot to do in this regard in terms of really meeting the potential of its economic cooperation or trade with the GCC countries. But it largely also depends on stability at home. If Pakistan has that peace and security and stability at home, then of course investments will come in, not just from China but also from other countries. I think that's the key. And now we have seen that with these developments in Afghanistan, there's some spillover. There have been a number of terrorist attacks now inside Pakistan. So Pakistan has to ensure that it is able to control that spillover by also focusing on peace and stability in Afghanistan, because that will affect Pakistan in the long run.
Sir, as you have mentioned the China factor, do you think that there would be the prospects for Pakistan and Gulf countries, states in CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? Can Pakistan and Gulf countries benefit from China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project? How would you analyze?
Earlier, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia had shown interest in investing in Gwadar, but that project really didn't kick off. As far as other countries are concerned, they haven't actually shown much interest in investing in CPEC or Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. And of course, China has taken the lead. Why would someone invest in a project which is led by China? They'll have to find elements which they can really lead, linked to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. That's a matter of, I think, finding some convergences in terms of investment, trade, and one cannot, disconnect completely the geoeconomics side of things from geopolitics. And if there are, political interests have a convergence, then ultimately, these countries will also collaborate more in terms of trade and economic cooperation.
Sir, how do you view or analyze Pakistan policy towards GCC member states or Gulf countries under the Prime Minister Imran Khan era, and what will be the future relations? How would you analyze?
At the beginning, I think when Imran Khan became the Prime Minister of Pakistan, in the beginning it looked like he was very comfortable with these young Gulf leaders, especially Mohammed bin Salman and then the Amir of Qatar and the two leaders of the UAE. He was very comfortable. They visited Pakistan. Imran Khan himself drove the car on some of those occasions. So there was a special kind of treatment that the Prime Minister offered to the leaders from the Gulf countries, and it looked like the relationship was very comfortable when also Imran Khan visited Saudi Arabia and the UAE and so on. But of course, then later on, there were some differences due to which, especially following the Abraham peace accords, there was pressure on Pakistan. And prior to that, Pakistan was really unhappy when in 2019, Pakistan approached the OIC to hold a special meeting on the Jammu and Kashmir issue when India had abrogated Article 370 of its constitution to remove Jammu and Kashmir of its special status. And there was some hesitation, especially I think from Saudi Arabia, to organize that meeting, because Saudi Arabia in many ways controls the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And then Pakistan's foreign minister, I think, issued a very angry statement in response. And there was another incident when India for the first time was invited by the host, the UAE, but also the OIC itself invited India to participate in a meeting in Abu Dhabi. Pakistan had strongly objected to that, but of course its request wasn't heard by both key Muslim countries in this regard, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So in recent past, we have seen ups and downs, but again, there is politics changes very quickly. Again, it seems that there is now a convergence in terms of national interests of GCC states and Pakistan, especially with reference to now Afghanistan, and that could play some role in normalizing the relationship. But moving ahead, Pakistan has to see a degree to which, Pakistan and GCC countries can increase their level of interdependence. So the relationship is not just one-sided. Pakistan has been providing security. Pakistani workforce there has, not only they have jobs, millions of them in the Gulf region, but they also send remittances back to Pakistan and contribute to Pakistan's economy. And GCC countries have come to Pakistan's rescue in times of crisis and so on. So there's a great deal of interdependence, and in return, of course, Pakistan provides them with security whenever there's a need for security, and also assurances of security as well, because Pakistan is one of the strongest armed forces in the Muslim world. So there's that aspect as well. So there's this interdependence, but that has to grow. I think trade will play a key role, and if Gulf countries invest more in Pakistan, and they have to also think of their economies once the oil runs out. And Saudi Arabia already, I think, is thinking about that. No one knows Aramco's, actual assets in terms of how much oil is left in Saudi Arabia. But it seems they have already been actually thinking of that future in which their economy is not purely dependent on oil. And for that, of course, they have to invest either at home or in other countries in terms of uh, like setting up other businesses or creating other sort of economic opportunities. And Pakistan, I think, is one of the ideal sort of or easiest options also for the Gulf region.
Sir, how would you conclude Pakistan-Gulf relations, especially Pakistan in Gulf perspectives, and what message would you deliver to Pakistan and Gulf countries or GCC states members leadership? How would you deliver your
I
message?
think GCC states have to understand Pakistan's sensitivities linked to the Jammu and Kashmir conflict with India. Pakistan understands that Pakistan is in no position to ask Gulf states to completely abandon their relationship with India. They are sovereign states. They have economic interests, economic cooperation. A lot of millions of also Indian workers work in the Gulf states. And recently we have seen that Indian Army chief visited Saudi Arabia, and I think that he visited the UAE as well. Their meetings have taken place when Narendra Modi visited Gulf region. A few years back, he received state honors and so on, and an Indian diaspora organized Modi's speeches, and I think in Dubai Stadium there was one, or Sharjah Stadium. So there was that level. Of course, Pakistan understands that it is in no position to ask GCC states to not cooperate with India, but at least diplomatically there is this expectation that Jammu and Kashmir issue, similar to the case of Rohingyas Muslims or like Palestinian Muslims and so on, Kashmiri Muslims issue has to also be prominent, especially because the OIC is the biggest forum for the Muslim countries. It has 57 member states and so on. So it's ideal forum in this regard to raise concerns with reference to Jammu and Kashmir issues. But at the level of the OIC, there have been meetings and there have been resolutions produced on the Jammu and Kashmir issues, but I think the Pakistan has this expectation that bilaterally some of these GCC countries could actually talk to India to revive that Article 370 or Jammu and Kashmir special status. That could also play a role in terms of normalizing India and Pakistan's relations. And GCC countries, I think, also should pay more attention to this issue, because if there is peace and stability between India and Pakistan, it will also serve their interests to equally benefit from their cooperation with both countries. And if there will be peace and stability in India, and the issue of terrorism would be addressed and so on in South Asia, these GCC countries can fully benefit from the true potential of trade or economic cooperation with both countries. So there's this level of, I think, understanding has to exist, and both sides have to understand each other's sensitivities. Pakistan understands that Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries, for example, have conflictual relations with Iran, and also Iran faces international sanctions due to this reason, not just international sanctions, but also due to Pakistan's understanding of GCC states' conflictual relations with Iran. Pakistan has not been able to fully benefit from the true potential of economic cooperation with Iran. So Pakistan understands this. And I think GCC states, they have to understand that Pakistan also has concerns linked to, and very genuine concerns linked to, the human rights violations in the Jammu and Kashmir region. So they need to raise their voice and use their leverage in terms of their relationship with the state of India to help the Kashmiri people. It's a matter of actually helping the Kashmiri people, not just helping Pakistan in this case, because the resolution of Kashmir dispute is not that easy, but at least the sufferings of the Kashmiri people could be reduced if some of these powerful Gulf countries, they intervene or they talk to the Indian leadership in this regard. So moving ahead, I think the leadership on both sides in Pakistan and in Gulf countries, they have to, I think, closely cooperate, meet more often to deal with their differences. They have to create other mechanisms to also, troubleshoot whenever there are some crisis or crisis-like situation. And Pakistan, for example, on the issue of Abraham Peace Accords, Pakistan didn't criticize, at least Pakistani leadership or foreign office, they didn't criticize the Abraham Peace Accords or the approach by Bahrain or the UAE in terms of their normalization of relationship with Israel. Pakistan, of course, has a historic position on the Palestinian issue, but still Pakistan has not criticized what has since evolved in the shape of Abraham Peace Accords, and now two GCC's key states have normalized relations with Israel. So, considering that, I think there is, there can be more win-win options, and it's important for both countries to explore those options and create maybe, not at the head of the state level, meetings cannot happen too frequently. They need to create another mechanism to discuss, how many of these differences can be addressed. And Pakistan's role is also important because Pakistan has a lot to gain from good relations with Iran and GCC countries. And Imran Khan, especially when he became the prime minister, he had expressed this interest in mediating between Tehran and Riyadh, and Pakistan has actually made those efforts. And historically, Pakistan has actually tried to resolve differences between the Muslim countries in terms of Qatar Gulf crisis, or you talk about the Gulf War or Iran-Iraq war and so on. Pakistan has tried a lot to resolve those issues, and GCC countries could also help deal with Pakistan's disputes with its neighboring countries, especially India, because all of them have very good relations with India, and they could use that leverage to mediate, which will in return, I think, will benefit them as well.
So thank you so much for your precious time, in-depth, valuable analysis on Pakistan, GCC States members relations, Pakistan relations with Gulf countries. And thank you so much again for joining the Die program, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you for the invitation.